Here's a special old guitar. This is a Gretsch 6119 Chet Atkins Tennessean. The date? Some question about that. We'll get into it. I think it's mid-60s. 64, 65-ish, maybe. The Tennessean is kind of the dressed-down version of the 6120, associated with Chet Atkins, obviously, Eddie Cochran in the 50s, Brian Setzer in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even today. It started off as a single pickup junior style guitar in 1958, and that pickup was in the bridge position, which is nice. Those first early ones from 1958, sometimes they're the iconic orange color we associate with Chet Atkins guitars, but some of them are also this really deep reddish tone, kind of like a cherry red that, well, I recall seeing one in a vintage guitar magazine a long time ago, sometime when I was in my teens, and I remarked to myself at the time, that might be the most beautiful electric guitar I've ever seen. It was something about the red color. It had a black plastic guard, had the old toaster style filtertrons. It was deeply pleasing to look at, and I've still never seen one in person. As it moved into the 60s, they added a second pickup. Then in 61, there was the major design change at Chet's urging. He was unhappy with the propensity for those deep, full, hollow body guitars he was using to feed back at stage volume. Can you imagine Chet Atkins turning it to 10 and really rocking out? Me neither. It must have been an issue though. So he had Gretsch come up with what they called the electro-tone body. It's a thin line, just about 2 inches, and it's still hollow, but there are no F-holes. Don't believe your eyes. These are painted on. Which could be seen as kind of cheesy, depending on your mindset. The concept works, by the way. These are much less likely to feed back. B.B. King had Gibson do the same thing to his signature Lucille 335 model, even though it was semi-hollow, you know, with the solid center plank, much less prone to feedback anyway. But F-holes, who needs them? They also gave it some more restrained colors, something you'd see in a mid-century boardroom, a stained walnut or dark burgundy, with guards that I believe were more silver than this when they were original. They've kind of yellowed over time. I don't think they're nearly as attractive as that red and black design that I saw when I was a kid, but they're still cool in their way. George Harrison played one. He also played the fancier country gentleman model, but this one got used in American tours in '65 when they went over there. So this one is in really great shape overall. The binding is excellent. You know, there are a lot of 1960s Gretches that are suffering from rotten binding. They must have bought a bad batch of celluloid or something, because like 80% of the time it looks like and has the consistency of blue cheese. People occasionally ask me if I will rebind one, and I tend to turn those down because it's not an easy fix. You know, to do this properly, you basically have to take the neck off, which isn't all that easy on these guitars, and it just takes forever. People think it's going to be a $300 job, and it is not. So the body's good. The headstock, however, folks, this is wild. To start off with, there's the decal. It's American Eagle there. I think that's actually the one from the seal for the U.S. Senate. This was bought in Wisconsin a couple of years ago. But here's the really odd thing. At some point, someone decided to turn this sucker into an 11-string guitar. Look at this nut. And a good look at the back. You see the plugged holes? Can you imagine tuners in those? I have real difficulty picturing it. They wouldn't be standard guitar tuners, obviously, because there's no place for the shafts to go. So it must have been like violin pegs. Maybe banjo friction tuners, but even that, these are too close together. The bushings wouldn't have fit. So, you know, the thing is, it doesn't matter which they were, because the strings coming out of them would have bumped into other tuning pegs. It's not a straight shot from the peg to the nut, so it could not have functioned. This was done in vain. Someone's bright idea probably came on in a haze of orange sunshine. Must have turned into a real downer, man. Oh, bummer. While we're back here, these are not the original tuners, though they're vintage and maybe even older than the guitar. These are from a more expensive model. Gretsch used them. These are the Grover Imperials, which were standard on like the White Falcon or the Country Club or the Country Gentleman. This would have shipped with a simpler open-backed tuner, which are still fine. They came from a Dutch manufacturer in the 60s, Van Gent, kind of distinctive looking, but not like these. So how did they get on there? Was this from the collection of a person who maybe had a bunch of different Gretches and decided to use up spare parts when he got something that was missing the tuners? Next weird thing. In 1964, Gretsch started putting a little metal plaque on the headstock. It's a rectangular thing with the model name engraved on it. Saying that though, there are mid-60s examples without a plaque that don't seem to have ever had one. Inconsistency reigns, of course. But if we get close in here, there appear to be pinholes from a place where the plaque should have been. However, in just the right light, there is the faint ghosting of a horseshoe-shaped inlay, which is not what you would expect, because that inlay is usually found on early 60s Chet Atkins 6120 models, the more fancy ones. So, what's the deal? Is this maybe a 1963 neck that was hanging around and wasn't used until a year or two later on a lower class model, and then they just put the plaque on top of the inlay to hide it? This is the kind of thing that can happen in guitar factories, you know. They have to keep production uniform while at the same time changing everything. Also, this gold binding effect, of course, is not original. It was painted on, by hand it seems, by someone who did a very nice job of it. Looks good. So, we're fixing this. Part of me actually loves the weirdness, though. It kind of pains me a little bit. But the customer wants it to look closer to stock. We're going to retire the eagle. I'm going to put an overlay on the backside to cover the plugs, and we can try to match the color. We're also going to see if we can unearth that horseshoe inlay. And I'm going to do this kind of archaeologically, if I can. And, you know, we've taken some decent photos of it in its previous state, so the story can be there for future generations to admire. So we'll lose the tuners. I took a pretty clear photo of the remnants of the serial number here, the portion that didn't get drilled through, and also another number that was etched into the surface that must be a social insurance number, I guess. There was a time when that was the thing to do, you know. Put that on there in the event that it ever got stolen. It would be an identifying marker. It's a practice that is frowned upon these days. We'll push out the bushings as well. There's some black paint on the front of the truss rod nut. And I'm not sure if this was painted with the cover in place or what, but there's kind of an outline there. I'm going to take some careful measurements of the thickness of the headstock before I begin here, because I want to end up somewhere around the same. There is a general widening in this area. There isn't a volute, but it does get thicker down towards the nut area. Let's see. Looks like we are approximately 605 thousandths at the distal end. Approximately. We are 650 thousandths. There's actually quite a difference in thickness from side to side, so it tapers across its width as well as this way. Anyway, I want to be somewhere around 600 to 650 thousandths. The nut is going away. This 0 fret is really very worn too, so we'll see what that's like when we're done. There seems to be quite a lot of epoxy under the nut. I want to protect this area because I'm going to be doing a bunch of sanding around here. Rather than use a stripper on this surface, I'm going to sand through. But it might be fun to start in the area of this horseshoe and see if that's actually under there. Just gently scrape. Yeah, there is something white there. This is interesting. As I start to sand, there's this heavy checking pattern which is appearing under the surface, which wasn't immediately evident, which is also quite different from the almost pristine look of the body as well. There's no checking on the body. I wonder if it's been refinished. Given the thickness of the finish, a sharpened cabinet scraper might be a help. Letters are appearing. G, H, the monogram of Gideon Hawke, an English pirate of the 18th century. Yeah, it looks like there's a big blob of epoxy here, which probably leaked through when they did the plugging. Okay, that's looking pretty good, that the letters are decipherable and I know what I have to re-inlay. The question is the horseshoe. What I thought was white may have just been a little bit of the top surface of the veneer. I have to excavate a bit further to see if there is actually something under here. I'm beginning to suspect maybe not. Or maybe it was there and then when whoever was drilling stuff out blew through it and it came out and he just filled it with epoxy. I'm assuming it's a he. Yeah, I think that's probably what happened. You know what? I don't think there is anything under here. There may have been a horseshoe and it came cracking out during the drilling process. So I'm now deeper than any inlay has the right to be. That's a little disappointing, I guess. So the channel is there, but no inlay. Here's a router base plate for those times when I want to remove a certain amount of material off a flat surface. In other words, it registers off the surface it's going to be cutting into. This one has got one side cut away so that the bit extends past it. That means that in the intersection between the headstock and the neck, I can get in tighter to that angle without bumping the base plate into the neck shaft itself. It's just a piece of 3/8 inch polycarbonate or acrylic or something. Hard and sturdy. And I use one of these string action gauges to set the height of the bit. I'm shooting for just around 25 thousandths because I'm assuming the thickness of lacquer is about 5 thousandths and the veneer I'm going to be putting on there is about 20 thousandths. So this should get me in the ballpark and cover those scars nicely. Kind of want a steady hand for this sort of thing. I left strips down either side unrouted so the base plate had something to register against. Those need to be planed off, and I sanded everything flush. I cut the veneer to just slightly oversize and made a hinge with some tape, as you can see here. I apply a coat of glue and flop the overlay back into place and clamp it up using some padded cawls. There are some kerf cuts near the end where the headstock gets thicker so it can bend a bit to conform. And I used a whole bunch of clamps to do this. After sufficient drying time, I'll pare back the overhang. I decided to not only fix the missing letters, but also put back in the horseshoe. As uncharacteristic as it's supposed to be for this model, I believe it was part of the instrument as it left the factory. And I read something online that proclaimed every Gretsch in that period was a prototype, and that does seem to hold up. If the owner wants to find a metal plate, it can always be obscured again, but I think it has to be there, right? So I traced as much of the original outline as was left. I scanned it, cleaned it up on the computer to make a pattern. The printed outline is so thin it almost doesn't show up on camera, but it fits the space well. I'll glue it onto a pearl blank. This might seem weird to those who know, because the original inlay is pearloid plastic. It's not real. I couldn't find anything that matched well enough to use. The stuff on the market now has a very different appearance. And as it turned out, real pearl was the easiest thing, because I figured I could dull it down with dyes if need be and make it look like the old stuff, but the new plastic just didn't match the old. So I get to do some very careful sawing and a little bit of filing. I had to get the needle files involved to really refine the interior corners and stuff. To transfer the correct slant for the lettering, I got out my angle finding gauge. A little more sawing, a little more sanding, a little more tricky this time because they're much smaller pieces. So small, in fact, I had to use tweezers to hold the small stem of the T and get it to the correct thickness. I wasn't so sure how the epoxy was going to respond to routing, so I outlined all the letters with a blade. I got out a little spiral upcut router bit here, which is about, well, it's less than 1 millimeter wide. It handles wood just fine, but as soon as it gets into the epoxy, within seconds it starts to clog up and I have to remove this gunk. Eventually I got the channels cut and glued in the letters. I mixed up some black epoxy and used that to fill in the outlines. When you're working with epoxy, usually there'll be a drying time or a hardening time listed on the package, and that could be 5, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. Maybe some extended ones as well for other industries. But there's also a curing time, which is often listed as, 24 hours or 48 hours. And then there's the real curing time, which can be quite significantly longer than that. For it to really reach its final stage of solidification. So usually there's a kind of grace period in there where it gets kind of like rubber or leather hard clay if you're into ceramics, which allows you to kind of pare off the excess with a chisel like this. So I'm just getting rid of some of the overburdening stuff. And it's not hard enough yet to sand. It's only been about 14 hours. But it's firm enough to cut through. I'll try and scrape through the additional lacquer on the sides of the headstock, which was quite dark in comparison to the rest of the neck. Get back to the original stuff if I can. I need to open up the shaft holes before I spray. I'll do that with a brad point bit from the inside here, which marks the centers with its central spur, so I can drill from the opposite side and not worry about tear out. I'm using the bit in reverse here, which scores and makes the clean cut. Then I'll come back with a countersink and just relieve the edges. The final step before finishing is I'm going to lightly dampen the surface with water to raise the grain. I'll sand that and it'll be ready for lacquer. Up next we have a piece of Hamilton, Ontario, that is, the place where I live, musical history. This one has got some stories to tell. This is a Gibson ES-330. That is like the fully hollow version of a 335. Basically the Gibson equivalent to the Epiphone Casino. There's no solid block down the center, it's fully hollow. It would originally have had P90 pickups, which have been replaced, as you see, with a mini bucker in the neck and a regular sized humbucker in the bridge. The word is it's probably from 1969. That's a little bit unclear because the neck has been replaced long ago. This guitar was owned by local Hamilton music legend Dave Rave, probably best known from his time leading the seminal Canadian punk band Teenage Head. He replaced Frankie Venom on vocals in the 80s. Dave actually started off as their singer in the very first iteration, the first lineup from Teenage Head, and Frankie was on drums. Dave went on to form the Shakers, which was another very influential, in a regional way, punk with early rock and roll leanings. I don't know the best way to describe them. Maybe Chris Spedding meets Gene Vincent meets, I don't know, George Thorogood and the Destroyers on a night when he doesn't have his slide. Good time, hard driving rock and roll. They put out a couple albums. After doing the Teenage Head thing for a few years, he put together another band called the Dave Rave Conspiracy, which has the distinction of being the very first Western act to release a rock album on a post-USSR Russian label. As soon as the Berlin Wall fell, they were right over. The album was called Valentino's Pirates. I remember watching a documentary about that at the time. He's done a lot of work as a session musician and also some producing. At this point, Dave's nephew now has this guitar. He unearthed it from Dave's mom's basement and cleaned it up a bunch. And it remarkably does not smell of mold. It's in pretty good shape. Now we come to the neck. It got broken at some point, badly. It's a punk rock story. You know how many times I have armchair experts who have never lifted a chisel suggest that I just order a new neck from Gibson? Anytime I'm doing work on a headstock repair and it's pretty nasty, it comes up every single time. That's not a thing. That just doesn't happen. If it's that bad, you're basically going to build your own new neck. Anyway, I think the work was done back in the 80s by another local legend, George Furlanetto. He was the man for repairs in this town for a good while. And he's also the founder of F-Bass. Started producing custom basses back in the late 70s, focusing, I think, mostly on 5- and 6-string models at a time when there weren't that many custom makers doing that. It was really difficult to get hardware for those things. I mean, there were no aftermarket suppliers. So if you wanted one, you know, if you were going to make a 6-string bass, you're going to be making your own pickups and bridges and stuff. So it was pretty involved. F-Bass is still around. They're going strong, producing some great stuff. So Dave took this to George Furlanetto, who made a new neck with this elaborate inlay. You don't see this on a factory Gibson. Apparently Daniel Lanois, famous musician and producer, he used to refer to this guitar as the Bible because it's really ornate in kind of a liturgical sort of way. I gotta tell you, it's probably got one of the nicest necks on a late 60s Gibson in existence, because at that time they were making them really skinny. That was the age of like 1 9/16 nut width. And this one here is really luxurious. Let's measure it. Yeah, this is 1 11/16. Full size. Feels good. The other rather unique feature about this guitar is the neck joint. These had short necks originally. They joined the body at the 16th fret. And I think this was probably the last year that was so. If memory serves, maybe it was 1970. I don't know. Don't quote me. They went to the longer neck and had it joined at the 19th fret. So, and that's what this has got. George has gone ahead and made a 19 fret to body joint. But in order to do that and not end up having to move the bridge position, he has squeezed that into the existing scale length. And that means that this is actually a shorter scale than usual. This is a 24.5-inch scale rather than 24 3/4. So it's not as short as something like a Birdland, but it is just a little bit snugger, which is kind of cool. It's a different feeling. Very comfortable. So the inlay here, done in mother of pearl and abalone. This wonderful swirling acanthus vine with features that look almost Japanese to me in some areas. It's gorgeous. And of course, you know, he did it right. Gibson style. He's got the binding coming up over the ends of the frets and little nibs. And frankly, if we're talking New Orleans era Gibson, George, I can guarantee you this is a better, more stable, and probably better playing neck than anything that was coming out of Gibson in the New Orleans era. So I think this is value added. This is a serious plus. This is not detracting points, in my mind, from the guitar. And of course, there has to be a reason for this thing to show up, and that is that the jack, it's probably had a patch cord plugged into it at the time, obviously took a good solid hit. These are front-facing jacks. And got punched directly into the body. Now it still functions. You can still plug in, but every time you do, it disappears a little bit farther inside. And that can't go on forever, right? So it's time to do something, and we'll repair this damage as best we can. I'm just taking the strings off and happen to notice a condition which you really want to take care of before it reaches this stage, especially if you're prone to changing strings in a dark tavern somewhere with the guitar lying on top of a bar stool. Because if this little screw goes a-flying, that's it. You're not playing that guitar this night. So there's a little, usually a little thrust washer, a wavy washer, and a nylon washer on these things. And there's a bit of a spring effect to them. So by tightening the end screw here, you actually change the feel of the tuner, and also prevent it from going boom and flying across the floor. I'm cutting away all of the loose and splintered material. You can see I've got a plug in the jack attached to a piece of wire, which will allow me to retrieve it once it falls into the hole. And here I'm drilling some holes for a routing template out of some plywood. Okay, it's always a risk putting tape on an old finish like this, but I got to do it in this case. Because, of course, this surface is undulating. It's a arched top, obviously, and I have to hold the template in place somehow. I can't just clamp it because it's going to rock in weird ways. So the way I do this, I've shown this before, is I use a little bit of epoxy putty on the bottom of the template and stick it directly in place. Let that cure, and it's a good stable base for my router. I've also made the plug that goes in there. It's a good snug fit. Had to fur it out in a couple of little places here where got a little bit generous with the sanding, but it fits as snugly as I can make it. So I will affix this in place and then I'll route. I'm not going to go all the way through, obviously, because I want to have a ledge upon which this will sit. The epoxy putty comes with hardener and putty in the same little cylinder, and by folding and kneading it activates. I like to do this for about 20 seconds or so. Folding it over continuously, I can end up with a million layers, which I figure is probably good enough to make the hardener do its thing. But really we're just looking for a consistent kind of color. And I'll put a little bit on each corner and get this centered, kinda, and press down. Let that sit for about 10 minutes to firm up. This is a hinge mortising bit. It's a fairly short length, which means I don't need an absurdly thick template to use it with. And it's designed for plunging into material, and it's got the ball bearing template guide. I did this in a series of passes. I want to end up with something about halfway through the thickness of the soundboard. measuring to make sure the jack is going to fit in the expected 3/8 of an inch hole. The plug in this area is only going to be about 2.5 millimeters thick. So I'm going to check and see what kind of exposure I'm going to have on the jack with it going through that kind of thickness. And it looks like it's going to be okay. It's not going to be a whole bunch of thread exposed above the surface. I have no fear about the maple being strong enough to hold it. That's 2.5 millimeters is plenty. I do want to remove the nut before I put this back in again though, because I wouldn't be able to retrieve the jack. I'm leaving the washers in place, and that'll all get hidden away. I should be able to retrieve the super long length of wire here with some tweezers or something. A generous coating of tight bond glue. Okay, just going to put a little bit of gentle pressure on here with a cam clamp and let that set up. And I think we'll call it a day. We'll move on to this either next week or the week following. We'll get through the finishing part of the project, and we'll hear how these guitars sound.